Yes, okay. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session, Nurturing Poetries, Poetry in Port Cities. First of all, we'd like to thank the very wonderful OV for hosting us. And this is co-organized in collaboration with the project Poetry and Politics, based at the University of Vigo, with different participants in different parts of the world. My name is Cornelia Gräbner. I'm one of the researchers associated with that project. I'm based at Lancaster University, but I'm joining you today from Liverpool, which is where I live. And we have three wonderful people who are running three wonderful poetry projects in Liverpool, in Cork, and in A Coruña, in Galicia, Spain. So a very warm welcome to Paul Casey from Oviedo, Yolanda Castaño from A Coruña, and Dave Ward from the Windows Project in Liverpool. We are going to have, first of all, a short introduction to the various projects. Hearing about their activities, how long they've been going, what their focus is, what their breadth and width is. And we are then going to have a discussion among the three of us, which I will be chairing. The theme of the session is how in port cities, in peripheral cities, so not capitals, we are nurturing poetry scenes, not only in the short term, but in the medium and long term. I would ask everyone to maybe speak a little bit slowly, because Yolanda's first language isn't English and she's making a special effort. We also have Pilar Cáceres with us, who's going to support Yolanda if she needs any support with the English. So thank you so much, Pilar, for being here. And we will, in the end of the session, if we have a bit of time, we can have questions from the audience to those three facilitators and organizers of poetry scenes. Poetry scenes, long-term and medium-term projects for poetry need a lot of nurture. Poetry is, in that sense, like a little plant. It needs people around it. It needs its sunshine. It needs its rest periods. It needs food, water, and a fertile soil. It is also a very resilient plant in that it can weather difficult times as well. Considering that the three projects that we are going to hear about have had a different duration. So the Windows project has been running for the longest, I think, out of the three of them. We will probably also have the chance to engage with those different rhythms of poetry scenes and of activities associated with poetries. So we are first going to hear from Dave Ward about the Windows project. Dave, when you're finished, if you could please give me the thumbs up, and then I'll pass it over to Yolanda and then to Paul. So Dave, please.
Okay, thank you, Cornelia. I'm co-founder and coordinator of the Windows project. We started in 1976, although some of our roots, to pick up Cornelia's metaphor, were from 74. We emerged in two ways. In around 74, I was running what were called Windows Music and Poetry Nights in Halewood Library. Halewood is, or was at the time, a Liverpool overspill housing estate attached to the old village of Halewood. We ran readings with music for 10 years in Halewood Library. We also started Smoke magazine. And then in 76, Dave Calder and I along with Caroline Duffy and Libby Houston, were invited to run poetry workshops for Merseyside Play Action Council. We felt this was a good idea, so we constituted ourselves as an association in 1977 in order to continue that work. Went on running readings, but now our main activity is running the workshops. We run workshops still with Merseyside Play Action Council play schemes, also in youth centres, with adults with learning difficulties, in libraries, still occasionally in schools. We used to run a lot of workshops in schools until austerity. We're now constituted as a charity and also as a company, what is it? Company, anyway, limited. Yeah, so we're still going as strong as we can under current circumstances. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave. And shall we just go straight to Yolanda, who's going to talk to us about the activities that have been unfolding in A Coruña.
Thank you, Cornelia, thank you all. I'm running basically two projects. One is residency for writers in A Coruña that I run myself, that I open myself as a private project with no help from private or public entities. And the other, and probably main project in this case, is the only monthly ongoing and regular poetry reading series that takes part in all Spain, featuring international guests. It takes part in a nice culture center in A Coruña, is promoted by the municipality, by the city, by the culture department of the city of A Coruña, and it brings together one poet in Galician language with another poet from the rest of the world for the last 13 years. Every month, both poets read in original languages, and we translate every poem into Galician, which happens to be the communication language, the bridge language. So we have brought Pulitzer Prize winners, candidates to Nobel Prize, national prizes, Cervantes poetry prizes, and many poets from 5 continents in front of the audience in A Coruña.
Thank you, Yolanda. And could you, so the name of the residence is Residencia 1863. Could you explain what that name means? Because not everybody might know.
Of course. Although it is, of course, international name, literary residency 1863, because it can be named in any language. But it takes the year when Rosalía de Castro published her Cantares Gallegos, one of her main works. Of course, Rosalía de Castro is the main figure of Galician literature, a poetess from 19th century. So this is meant to be the year of the Renaissance, the Resurgimento, Renaissance of Galician literature. And it happened to be exactly the same year when this building was built in the heart of the historic city center of A Coruña. So that's why we took this name, since we have this apartment from 19th century with the stone walls and chestnut tree roof or ceiling, and it brings us the taste of those wonderful times. It overlooks the boats of the bay in A Coruña, and it hosts a writer every month, supported by an entity or wherever. And I didn't mention also the name of the poetry reading series, and its name is Poetas de Inversos. And it takes part, as I said, every month for the last 13 years.
And so poetas dinversos is, it has brackets around the N, so it could be poetas inverted, yeah, inverted poets, yeah.
Not exactly. It plays with two meanings, of course, as you have guessed. Diverse poets, so because it speaks about all the diversity that we are trying to bring, because our aim is to have the highest quality, of course, literary quality, but also the highest diversity in every sense. Sex, gender, system, geography. We, of course, include massive to stateless, minoritized languages, generations, and all kind of diversity. So diverse poets, and poet, they say poetry, something like that. Poetas din versos. In Galician, we will say poets say, pronounce, read poetry. Verses.
Thank you. Yeah, and shall we move on to Paul, who will speak to us about Ovail?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I could talk about Ovail for a long time, so you have to cut me off if I keep going, because I do love it, I must say. I started Ovail in 2007, so we'll be 15 in April. We have had over 650 events. I think for the first 13 years, we had an event every week, or 50 events of the year. So it was just the Christmas period we took a break. So that became extremely full-time. We've hosted over 1,000 poets, published or otherwise established poets. So at this stage, we've really managed to go around the world, really, in terms of our reach and in terms of bringing people to Ireland. So we're very fortunate in that way. I started it in 2007 because I had concerns about where poetry was in Ireland, for one. There were a lot of poetry festivals that were specific to the page and more traditional modes of writing at that time. This is prior to the economic bust, and I found it was quite exclusive and not, it kind of looked down its nose at things like spoken word and even experimental forms of neo-modernist poetry, etc. And that really concerned me. I originally would have come out of a spoken word background. Poetry came to me in the 90s, and then about 20 years ago, it just burst out of me into spoken word, and that's where I began. Even though now I write mainly for the page. I connected with the oral traditions of Ireland, which are always based in the spoken word, of course, and I lived for 20 years in Southern Africa, and I was surrounded by the oral traditions of the Zulu and the Xhosa people, and I can speak Zulu because of that, and which is quite fortunate. I do love languages, and Irish as well, which is very, very poetic language. Sometimes when I hear people just speaking it who are native speakers from the Gaeltacht, that they're just speaking poetry. They just need to open their mouths and they're just talking poetry. So for me, it's got a very strong oral tradition. I wanted to somehow do something about this perception that we all got in school that poetry is, it's all ancient form and it's all John Donne basically, and you have to essentially rewire your whole brain just to understand a couple of lines of it. So it became, something people were allergic to. The same thing happened with the Irish language, actually. They worked in tandem in that way. So to try and counter those perceptions, and also to try and create a more inclusive environment. I started Ovail then, and now it's grown into something a lot larger. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. So I think one one thing that we can notice, one characteristic that we can notice in all those projects is the desire to engage with a wide range of people, as wide as possible. In some of your contributions, we've also already heard a few allusions kind of to the port cities as being cities which are generally welcoming. So the presence of water tends to be quite prevalent. Yolanda was speaking about the Residencia looking out over the bay. And water is, of course, the flow of water, the rhythms of water is, of course, always a presence in the port cities. So could I just ask you to maybe speak a little bit more to bring to our listeners a bit of a tapestry of a panorama of the cities which have become the homes to your projects, and maybe how these cities are present in the projects, in the outline, even in the topography of the projects that you are facilitating. And Yolanda is nodding. So Yolanda, would you like to go first on that one?
Yeah, why not? Well, as you know, A Coruña is not the capital of Galicia. The capital of Galicia is, of course, Santiago de Compostela, a very important city concerning heritage, history, culture, and all that. But and in fact, Santiago tended to be a very important city, culturally speaking, more especially in all decades, past decades, like, for example, 80s or even 90s. But I must say, in my opinion, if I am allowed to be a little bit critical with the scene up there and the kind of audience up there, although I admire it, and of course it's a wonderful and very interesting audience, it is tends to be a little bit more endogamic, connected to the university. Of course, they have a very old university up there in Santiago and all that. So sometimes it is always the same kind of people, the same audience, the same really fun readers and poetry lovers and literature lovers and all that. To the contrary, A Coruña tends to be a very open city, a port city, very open to the influence of all that was coming by the sea or from the sea. It has the tradition of being a very open city, very interested in what's going on in the UK, why not in America, and overseas, and even more closer here in France or wherever, or in Portugal. So it is always, it has some fresh air running here and there all the time. And in fact, you can feel that the audience in A Coruña is more open. And for example, it had approached our activities, or in general poetry activities, coming from theater in some cases, or coming, why not, perhaps from music scene, or coming from the comic or visual arts. They are curious and they get interested and they approach our activities, or poetry or literary activities in general. So one can really test, one can really confirm how open it is. We have had some, we can say, management work on this direction, management of audiences, we could call it. For example, when we brought some poet that happened to be also an architect, we went to the Faculty of Architecture and we tried to engage, to make the people in the audience, the teachers, but also the students, the community at the Faculty of Architecture interested in our readings. They gave us the opportunity, they came to the reading, and after that they felt interested in these readings. They hadn't had experienced poetry as this kind of phenomenon, and after that they engaged our series, and they came every month So that's only an example, but in some other cases, our poets are, for example, musicians, and some musicians come to the readings. So this can tell that how open and mixed and diverse the city is. And yes, also the fact that it is practically all surrounded by the sea, because as you probably know, A Coruña is a peninsula. So practically all of it surrounded by the sea, and bringing all these currents. And our readings are not so close to the sea, but we can still feel this fresh air all the time.
Thank you, Yolanda. So what you were saying just reminded me just now reminded me very much of Liverpool, and of the stories that I've heard of the Liverpool poetry scene, which has been very lively since the 1960s. So shall we just carry on there with Dave?
Yes, well, Liverpool has, I think, the oldest Black community in Europe, the oldest Chinese community in Europe. We've got a magnificent Chinese arch. It's a very multicultural city. There's large Irish population, a lot of Welsh influence. I'm told there's over 100 different languages are spoken in Liverpool. So it's always been open to influences coming in from the outside, and I think that's obviously very, very healthy for the city and for its poetry.
And obviously it has a link with the 1960s as well, with the poetry scenes that were emerging then. Do you want to talk a little bit more about Liverpool as a sort of in its history as a poetry city?
Well, yes, and I guess the port element comes into that, but crucially in the 1960s, Brian Patton, Roger McGough and Adrian Henry started running public readings in the Everyman basement, the basement of the Everyman Theatre. That was drawing in a new sort of poetry audience. Adrian Henry also put on events and happenings there that involved music and mime and custard pie throwing, I think, all manner of things. So you know, those three poets were taken up by Penguin Books and had an international bestseller as a book of poetry. So that was huge. So since then, Liverpool has attracted poets to it. It was the reason I came to the city. It's also energized poets who are growing up in the city. There are discussions at the moment of setting up a Liverpool Poetry Centre. Curiously, at the first meeting of that, the three poets known as the Liverpool poets were scarcely mentioned. So possibly, as with the Beatles, the city feels it's moved on, but I mean, you can't deny their influence. Dave Calder continued, was involved in those early readings, continued on the readings and events at O'Connor's, which was a big venue for poetry and music. You could perform to over 200 people there. Subsequently, there were readings in the Why Not pub and the Gazebo Cafe Bar. And I mean, it was that led me to start the readings in Halewood, and we linked in with other poetry scenes. So I think it's always been about promoting poetry to a wider audience, and for sure being in a port city is a big part of that.
Thanks, Dave. And shall we move on to Paul, because obviously there's this deep connection between Liverpool and Ireland, and also just to make the link to some of the points that Yolanda was making, making. There is Irish as a language, there's Galician as a language, and then the many other languages that have come to these cities at some point over the past 200, 300 years, ever since those ports have opened up. So Paul, would you like to continue just telling us a little bit about Cork?
Yes, sure, I'd love to. There's so much to say about Cork. Again, I could be here all day, so you might have to stop me. Cork is really very much founded and based on the city of Cork, really on two main things. The fact that it's built on just near the mouth of the largest port, the largest, should I say, harbour in Ireland, and the second largest natural harbour in the world after Sydney Harbour. It's a very, very significant harbour. On which lie a number of towns all around that harbour, and of course ships have traditionally come up through the harbour and up straight into the city for centuries and centuries, and they used to come right up Patrick Street up until only about 200 years ago, when they covered over those inlets and made them into roads. So it has been a reclamation since the Viking times of marsh area on the middle of a river, just downstream from which is a massive harbour. And then, of course, the English market, which was really the hustle and bustle of the city, you know, and the lifeblood, really, of Cork City for a good number of centuries. All the tax into the council came from there. So a huge amount of import and export, certainly the largest population in the southern part of Ireland and in the Munster region, and along with Kerry, I guess, and Cork, really have a very, very strong tradition of poets and poetry, and so it would have been a hub for all that. There would have been a great amount of trade, both with our neighbours across the Irish Sea, and of course down in Gräbner as well. For many, many centuries, Cork would have been a place for all of those sailors to come and trade. So of course that would have influenced the poetry over the years. I echo what Yolanda said about, you know, a port city being one that is very open. It does indeed, you know, statio bene fide carinis is the motto of Cork City, you know, which means a safe harbour for ships. So it's really a place for anyone to come and be safe and to connect. So it has a long history of inclusiveness, really. And so, you know, we have a festival every June, the Cork Harbour Festival. Rovale takes part in that, and you know, it's very maritime themed. You know, it's connected to our ocean to city races. You know, we have large yachting communities. You know, all sorts of maritime related communities all around Cork and its harbour. And so, you know, these topics, these themes will be very strong among the poets and the musicians over the year. Poetry and music are very close together in this part of the country, for sure. In fact, all over Ireland. But we've got a strong connection with both Liverpool and Galicia, really. I mean, Galicia, just two weeks ago, I was reading at a festival in Kerry called the Amergin Festival. Amergin being, of course, the son of Mill, of the Milesians, the Celts who came from Cornelia, and they brought with them the Iron Age, and they brought, you know, in around 500 BC, they brought the first poetry to Ireland that we have recorded. They say there's poetry before that, but we have 3 existing extant poems by Amergin, who was the first Milesian Celt to put his foot onto the shore of Ireland. So we have a strong connection, and we have had for many, many years with the northern regions of Spain, in particular, what we call our Celtic brothers and sisters down on the south side. So that continues today. We have a strong relationship ourselves with Vigo as well, and every year, even Yolanda has read at our festival in the past, and we have Galician poets coming along, and of course Liverpool. I mean, we go to Liverpool, and it's basically half Irish, I would say. You know, you can't walk through Liverpool without finding an Irish pub or hearing an Irish accent, or being able to buy an Irish beer. I've actually read down in the basement of the Everyman, down, I think it was 2008, and I was thrilled actually with the reception I got there. I also found it very embracing and warm and inclusive, and I felt immediately welcomed. I think I would have brought some of that spirit back to me, because I was only in the early phases of developing Ovale at that point. So, you know, I like to believe that these connections have existed for very long, and that they are very strong, and that they will continue to do so long into the future.
Thanks, Paul. I was just going to ask, would you like to respond to each other? If you would like, you could just raise your hand so that I can then call on you. I don't want to just launch into the next sort of question or theme without having given you the opportunity to respond to each other, if you wish to do that. Yeah, Dave?
Just to add to what Paul said about friendly audiences in Liverpool, the poet Kevin Crossley Holland came to Liverpool, and he's from Norfolk, and he was surprised by two things. One was we sent him to a school to do a workshop, and he came back and said, Dave, 90% of the children are on free school meals. And I said, yes, they are. He said in Norfolk, 10% of the children are on free school meals. But he also did a reading, I think Paul may have been referring to the Dead Good Poets Society, who were meeting in the Everyman basement. Kevin did a reading there, and he said, Dave, he was bowled over by how not just friendly, but inquisitive everyone was. He said, Dave, people were asking me questions after every poem. Normally, I'm used to, you know, everyone sits in silence and there's polite applause at the end, and maybe people are very shy and ask the odd question in the bar afterwards. But he couldn't get over the fact that it was a poetry reading was an organic event where everyone felt involved with it.
And of course, we still have the lovely word down in the basement of the Everymans, don't we?
Yeah.
Even today, yeah.
Yes, I think that they've also, well, during a COVID lockdown, they were having readings in the open air in the St James's Garden underneath the imposing Anglican cathedral.
Mm-hmm. Would anybody else, Yolanda or Paul, would you like to comment on any of that, or shall we move on maybe?
Oh yes, it's very interesting what they have been saying, and all these Celtic roots that bring us together, put us together. That is something that we share, of course. But and yes, and also the condition of our cities of being so welcoming somehow and opened. Partly thanks to this port, these harbors. The motto of A Coruña is the city where nobody is a foreigner. So that's more or less the spirit, yes.
Mm. So maybe that sense of hospitality and that openness towards experimentality and of trying out other forms of art, of seeing how different forms of art connect with each other, music, poetry, painting. Yolanda mentioned architecture. Maybe that's something that we could sort of follow up on. And Yolanda, you've already spoken a little bit of how specifically you do this, that you create events and that you create the opportunity for people from various art practices to come together. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, yes, it's always very interesting and enriching for both readers and also, of course, writers, or amateurs or more professionals that can be living in the city, to, of course, to keep on very attentive, very with their ears wide open to what's been what's written in the rest of the world, and not only what is written, but any kind of art form, of course. So a very good way to experience all these new practices are, of course, bringing them to A Coruña. That's why we are very interested, and we work very hard in bringing very diverse practices. So from the most classical ones to the most experimental ones, and also from time to time we bring this hybrid interdisciplinary forms of poetry, mixing poetry with performance or music or visuals, for example. And concerning this extra effort that we do, like going to catch the audiences from where they are, for example, a faculty of architecture, or not only, or sending mails to some theater scene or something like that. It also appeals to the languages. For example, I don't know, if we are bringing an important Japanese poet, we try to get in contact with the small Japanese community that we have in A Coruña, made by, for example, mixed couples. And so we, in that case, we approach the official languages school, or the School of Languages in A Coruña. We go to the Department of Japanese, and this head of the culture Japanese, head of Japanese language studies is in contact with all these former students of Japanese and mixed couples or mixed families in A Coruña. So they feel interested in these readings, and perhaps after this first reading, they get involved and get engaged in this phenomenon, in this culture manifestation. So after some small efforts, we add more and more audiences that follow us.
Thanks, Yolanda. Paul, do you want to comment on that, maybe on the...
Sure, yeah. I probably echo a lot of what Yolanda has said again. Cork is really a festival city. Actually, there's a festival almost every week of the year, usually, or BC, as Morris Reardon calls it. It has been a festival city, so there's rarely a week in the calendar year that doesn't have a festival. And so the arts are extremely vibrant and progressive here, all sorts of art forms, and also because it's a small city, a lot of people know each other across art forms. There's a lot of cross-genre mixing, hybridity, if you like, experimentation. I mean, we're connected with a lot of the festivals over the years. The Cork Jazz Festival for many years. We had jazz poetry nights, so we would fuse poetry with a lot of those other art forms. It has a very strong filmmaking community, especially in the last couple of decades. It's turned into something, quite a force, actually. A lot of filmmakers now down this part of the country making fantastic work. So, of course, poetry films, that's our crossover with that. We run a big international competition for that. We just announced our winner, this year's winner for this event, Janet Lees from the Isle of Man. So, again, as Yolanda was saying, that opens up more audiences for your art form. Suddenly people who are interested in film now get to experience poetry in different ways. People who are interested in jazz get to experience poetry in different ways, and also through phrases works. With multimedia setups, you can have a lot of word art experimentation. you know, fusing different art forms together, and poetry can tie a lot of those together. In fact, it's a very strong glue, and a very powerful one to cement and to bring together different art forms. It's a fantastic foundation. So yeah, you know, from a diversity point of view, and from a cross-genre point of view, we're very fortunate here in that there's always something new being discovered, being experimented with, being created. And as I said, we've a very vibrant artistic community, and we're very fortunate for that.
Dave, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean the same traditions of multimedia, including poetry, goes a long way back in Liverpool. Adrian Henry had his poetry rock band, the Liverpool Scene, supported, I think it was Led Zeppelin at the Isle of Wight Festival, and toured America. Going way before that, Edith Sitwell performed her avant-garde multimedia piece Facade in Liverpool Central Library that had music by the composer William Walton. Edith Sitwell was hidden behind a screen and was reading through a megaphone. More recently, Eleanor Rees has collaborated with musicians. I've done multimedia pieces, including dancers, similarly Sean Street. So the idea that poetry is always one person speaking to an audience, while that can be riveting, I think promoters have to think about what an audience would want over a 2-hour session, and sometimes having a musician with the poet or film with the poet actually makes for a more interesting mix of reading evening, rather than only listening to 2, 3, 4 poets speaking by themselves.
Dave, just following up on this, because I know Windows Project does many workshops, and that's, I think, one of your main activities recently, isn't it? So you start working with quite young children, and then you take them sort of through the generations and or through their times of discovering their voice. And yeah. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about this kind of nurturing sort of project really that you've got going, the nurturing that you do in the workshops, and maybe how that, if it is at all inspired from the interaction with different languages and genres, or yeah, if you could just say a little bit more about that. I think there's also something about social diversity and social embeddedness there, and maybe you could clarify what you said about the children on free school meals, because not all our audience members might understand the implications of that and what that means.
Free school meals is if the parental income is below a certain level, then your children get free school meals. Yes, Windows has over the years attracted and also trained and coached a wide range of mainly poets, but also script writers, novelists, and so on, to run the workshops. And I think the important thing is that they are good at their own art form, but we're not looking for people who are simply self-promoting, that once you've started running a workshop, it doesn't matter who you're published by, where you've performed. You need to focus on doing a workshop with these young people who probably won't know what else you've done in the world of literature and writing. So we're looking for a quite particular form of person, creative person, who is able to pass on that creativity to young people and other participants. Dave Calder and I worked at Great George's Project back in the 70s, and the Great George's Project promoted the idea of passing on art through games. So we've continued that on. We have a whole range of games that we have made. They're like either board games or small-scale fairground sideshows. We still have the amazing push poem machine, which was given that name by Carol Ann Duffy when she worked on the very early workshop. They're all brightly painted, attractive to look at, robust in construction, because they will take a lot of wear and tear. And they draw people in. So you can't just walk into a play scheme or a youth club and say, who wants to write a poem on your first visit? You might be able to later, but not on your first visit. So if you've got a game that people play, and it works with adults as well. We've also done sessions in Tate Gallery, Liverpool, with family groups, and the adults play alongside the children. And it loosens up your mind, makes it more receptive to creativity, gets you thinking, and then you can create your own piece of writing, and then usually go on to do a piece of artwork which displays the poem, whether it's a wall hanging or a poster or a postcard. Every year we publish a booklet of a selection of the poems from all the different places we've worked. Judy Mazonovich has been running sessions recently called Moon Soup, which are all with adults with learning difficulties, and we've had some amazing results from that.
Can you, I think we're all very curious now to hear more about the games. Could you maybe give us an example and tell us a little bit about one such game might work?
Well, the amazing push poem machine, to begin at the beginning, has a brightly painted board and backboard with all the letters of the alphabet except X and Z, because mainly words in English don't begin with X and Z. They tend to be embedded within a word. You throw a ball to see if you can get a letter. Some people find that very hard. Some people find it a bit easier. You almost certainly won't get the letter you're aiming at. So you then put up a word beginning with that letter, but the next player has to follow on from that word, and it needs to keep building as a recognizable sentence. It may be bizarre, it may be silly, it may be surreal, but it's got to make grammatical sense, otherwise it doesn't really work. Adults are usually a pain in the neck because they want to tell you the longest, hardest word that begins with that letter, and you have to point out to them politely that doesn't really help the ongoing poem. But it's lots of fun, and it can be used as a starting point for individual poems. When we were first doing it, the children would throw, at that time, a large yellow football up a big brightly painted ramp, but they'd get a series of letters, and then they'd get words from that, but then they'd make an individual poem from that. Frank is drunk and yet lost is a memorable one. That's from 1976. Other games, there's one called Amazing Animals, where you start with your own initials, but you roll dice to get 3 parts of 3 different animals, and then you join them together to make your own mythic beast, and you can make up what you like about that. The spells game was first invented very quickly for Halloween a long time ago, but it sort of I decided to take the risk of turning on its head the fact that normally we say to participants, you don't have to worry too much about spelling. But in this game, we actually challenge people to spell a word beginning with the letter that they land on. By the strict rules, if they get it right, they can keep that word and put it in their spell or poem or story. We discovered that the words that work best are all from the natural world, but really have no other connotations with Halloween. We've got numerous other games, and we keep inventing new ones.
Brilliant, thank you, Dave. It sounds like people are having a lot of fun, which I think, you know, that's also very important for poetry, to make it fun, especially for the younger people who might wish to get involved in it. Yolanda and Paul, would you like to come in a little bit on how, whether you're running any like training programs or workshop programs? I think you're all doing this also for different, for people of different ages and for different publics and constituencies. Yolanda, do you want to go ahead on that?
I have been running poetry workshops in 6 of the 7 cities in Galicia, including, of course, A Coruña, but they were not so connected with the Poetas de Inversos Poetry Reader series. Still, of course, it nurtures somehow these audiences, because I perfectly remember how one of these workshops, somehow a group of people, group of readers come together to this workshop that I ran, and they stayed together, they kept together, and now they make their own meetings and all that, and they, of course, very often come to our readings. But it's not only the workshops, the literary workshops that I run, but the other literary workshops that exist in the city, because I must say, after the Poetry Reader series was born, a school of creative writing was set in the city. A very nice one called Apiario, and all these people, all these students and audience of this and people linked to this creative writing school very often come to our readings in group even, or they comment the readings, or they even prepare, they work on the on the poetry of they invite the guest poets. So that's very interesting. And just to mention something else about the social panorama that can be also interesting. The reading series of Poetas de Inversos take part in a very interesting culture center that has been built not in the city center, but in the neighborhood that is more, let's say, in the surroundings. And it's a magnificent, with modern architecture, culture center, but it was built there because this is one of the most populated, or the most populated neighborhood in A Coruña. It is not very beautiful itself neighborhood, one of those that was built in the late dictatorship era. So in the 70s, for example, or 60s or 70s, making the most of the soil and with very cheap materials. One of these neighborhoods that you probably know that were built at that time in practically in every Spanish city, and now is inhabited with medium to, of course, working class, many immigrants and all that. Of course, it's as I say, it's not in these posh neighborhoods in the city center. So that's it boosts the social let's say, moving, because the posh people from the, excuse me for speaking like this, people from the city center has to move to this neighborhood to attend a poetry reading, or even a ballet or theater or whatever. And also the citizens from this neighborhood can come to a wonderful poetry reading in their vicinity. So I think, socially speaking, is a very interesting thing in our case.
Thanks, Yolanda. And Paul, would you?
Yeah, sure. So much to respond to there. Yes, I think when you're in a position where you're nurturing, as you call it, poets, you know, it's a very humbling position to be in, and it comes with a lot of responsibility, because you really need to understand what the needs of poets are, you know, and that is a very multi-dimensional realm. And you know, for me, the first and most important thing is to have a consistent, reliable environment within which poets of all shapes, sizes, backgrounds, influences, genres, etc., can flourish and feel that they can develop on their terms, an environment within which they can experience a broad range of what's possible. So bringing into that environment a wide diversity of international and regional poetics, you know, in all their different forms. And for that specifically to be consistent, really, I think that's the main thing, so that they can develop long-term and in turn pass on that knowledge to other young writers. And then, of course, there is the schools. Now we do you know, we're in the 10th year this year as well of running the Unfinished Book of Poetry project. So every year we take on 5 secondary schools in the city, and I find other poets to work with me with about 50 students every year to produce you know, to go through a series of about 9 workshops over 4 months, and we produce a big anthology every year. It gets launched by the Lord Mayor, you know, in the city library. So it's a big, you know, affair, a big event in the lives of young writers. You know, when I was a young writer at that age, you know, I thought all the poets were dead. I thought they were all, you know, lunatics, and you know. And that poetry was, you know, crazy thing. You know, I didn't really connect to poetry until my young adulthood because it was taught so badly at school. But now we know that nurturing poets and writers, you know, we need to be looking into the next generation, you know, when it comes to that. My partner Rosie even works with early years, 2- and 3-year-olds, you know, in the rudimentary stages of developing joy or an interest or having fun with words and rhythms and sounds and the musicality of poetry, and how important that is in terms of connectivity, and also you know, allowing people to understand how their own communication skills and problem-solving skills can become so much more you know, efficient and viable throughout their lives, you know. And so diversity is part of that, obviously, bringing in different people, different registers, you know, also making sure that, you know, you're not sticking in one area at all, you're not, you know, repeating the same thing over, and you are maintaining a connection with the other art forms, and you're maintaining the sense that everything can change, that there's nothing, you know, set in stone. You know, there's so many things to think about. You're constantly learning from the people who are involved in you know, when we have, as I said, for 13 years, we had an open mic and a reading series. In fact, every week of the year almost, you know, we started also with a poetry game, which we call the 5-word challenge. It's become quite popular. We publish a book every year called the 5 Words Anthology. and we have an international 5 words competition, which runs throughout most of the year, and that 5 word, I suppose, challenge, which we really began, just about 15 years ago, has now moved into the surrounding provinces, into the surrounding counties. There are a lot of other poetry events that are using it because it's such a great icebreaker. The audience throw out 5 random words, out of nowhere, and now you've got to put them together in 10 minutes, make something, do something, have some fun. And if you want to get up and say a poem, great. And if you get the loudest clap, you're going to get a free pint from the bar, and you're going to get a free book of poetry and Bob's your uncle. And you go down in the role of 5-word challenge winners. So it's also about keeping it fun, of course, but also allowing space for poetry to take people wherever they want it to take them. Life being as complicated, I suppose, as it is.
Thank you. Would any of you like to just pick that back up and respond in any way?
I know I did the 5-word challenge, Paul, when I was over with Eleanor. I came second. I got picked to the post, but it was lots of fun.
I've done it as well, and I remember the word spaghetti. And it's really not very easy to put the word spaghetti into a poem. I didn't find it easy.
Rhyme with it.
Yeah.
Rhyme with spaghetti.
Yeah, so I was one of the something I heard kind of from each of you as you were talking about how you are nurturing these through workshops, how the people who are participating in the workshops then move on to do other things, write their own poems, respond to other poets, maybe even create their own events. I was the word that came to me was attunement. Yeah, the way in which all seem to be very attuned to the wider social environment, but also to specific groups or even maybe specific people, specific individuals. And I was thinking that writing poetry is also about attunement, and listening to poetry is also very much about attunement. It almost means like tuning into somebody else's deep choices of words and somebody else's modes of perception. And you're all 3 of you are also poets. So I was wondering if I could invite you to reflect on how that attunement that you might have as poets with words, how that attunement is linked with that social attunement, that socio-poetic, if you so wish, attunement that you have within your activities as in nurturing poetries. Mm-hmm. Paul, do you maybe want to go first? Because always somebody else has gone first so far.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a big question. It's a lovely question, actually. It's one that I probably take some more time to think over. Attunement is really a state of being, I think. When poetry teaches you to attune more finely and more carefully and more patiently, that translates, that teaches you, you're undergoing change. Poetry is about constant growth and change and inner development and understanding and discovery and enlightenment, etc., etc. And that, is a process which translates immediately into the rest of your life. Everything you do, even shopping down the shopping aisles, you become far more attentive to things, details, in everyday life. You become more aware, far more aware, I think, and an individual poem can can make you hyper aware of something you were completely had no idea, you know, about, and suddenly you're thinking about that thing for a long time. But that translates, you know, translates into the relationships you build with people. You know, again, it's part of an ongoing development and process that you're sharing. It's a journey you share with other artists that are undergoing the same thing really as you. And it's about recognizing that in them and them recognizing it in you. And, you know, about having someone to witness your journey and while you witness their journey. It's a very shared experience, I think. You know, I'm not sure if I've answered you very well, but I completely agree with the sense that, you know, reading poetry, writing poetry, and indeed, you know, working with poets and with the wider community, you know, requires, you know, careful attention to, you know, a careful connection, careful attunement, a careful tuning in to what's actually going on, and to broaden that bandwidth, if you like, so that, you know, you're trying to be as open as possible, you know, so you don't want to miss a thing, especially when it comes to younger people. You know, you've got to be on the ball nowadays. They're ahead of the game. They're way ahead of the game, and they're going to be running the show in about 20 years time from now. We're going to be walking down to the local you know, open mic session, and we won't be the ones running it anymore.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's also passing it over to younger people. Yolanda has just unmuted. Would you like to respond to that?
I am not very sure how to answer this question, but it's true that Poetas de Inversos tries to empower or put in value what's been written in Galician, and also to get very aware, get informed about what's been written in the rest of the world. We put together these two poets at the same level, in the same stage. So, for example, we listen to poet reading in Galician, and then followed by Adam Zagajewski or Mark Strand or Anna Blandiana or Adonis. So it's that I think somehow we try to be attuned with this values, no, to be self-rooted in our culture, in our literature, but also to be part of the world and all its speeches. At the same time, how to say? I think we are probably not the richest part of Spain, a territory in Spain, like Catalonia or something like that. But concerning poetry, we have been one of the most referentials in this part of Europe, as we have had our medieval songs, the Galician Portuguese medieval songs that were a reference in all Europe, and somehow you also try to be very literary ambitious, cutting edge, and not self-indulgent when we write poetry. So I think we write with our head quite high. I mean, in feeling ourselves like part of this world poetry.
So it's not only about tuning into the local environment, but it's also tuning into what goes on in different parts of the world.
Yeah, both things.
Thanks, Yolanda. Dave, do you want to?
I think attunement is a really good word, and certainly I've become conscious that that's what's happening when running a workshop in a community venue, because we try and do the writing one-to-one with the participant. But what you're doing is tuning into that participant and drawing a poem from them, getting them talking, seeing what ideas they have. You're not imposing ideas on them. And the same thing is true of the process of writing a poem. I think the best poets will be attuned to the landscape around them, the trees, the sky, the sea, the river, and also the people. You have to have an empathy, but if you don't have that, you're just going to write sort of rants about your own feelings without tuning into other things. Yeah.
Thank you. I was gonna touch maybe on a topic which has been kind of mentioned, sort of in passing, and that is austerity. Because as poetry organizers or facilitators, you depend very much, or you often draw on public funds, and all these three countries, so Spain or Galicia, Ireland, and UK have been subjected to austerity politics recently, and that has affected the arts particularly. So I would like to invite you to maybe reflect on how the panorama has changed on that in the recent years, and how you've been meeting these challenges, and also to reflect on what a good state funding can achieve. Because in the austerity rhetoric, very often the funding for the arts is seen as something that's dispensable, and is often portrayed as something that didn't work anyway. And therefore it can just be taken away. So I'd like you to maybe reflect on how how state projects can work, but the good they do, but also how you've been meeting that challenge of having the funding cut into, but also having the arts often devalued by the rhetoric that is out there by government and in the media. And I think, Dave, you've mentioned the word austerity before, so maybe I'll just ask you to start us off on this one.
Well, I remember sitting in the Blue Coat Art Centre with poet and writer Dinesh Aliraja when our Conservative government first invented, and it was invented, austerity. And Dinesh said, we may not have realised that we've just been living through a golden age. The Windows project in part came into existence because the Arts Council was developing what was called community arts funding, and that's why we became an organisation, so that we could apply for such funding. And we were a regularly funded organisation for many years. We had one full-time, 2 or 3 part-time posts funded to run a very large programme of work, as well as the freelancers who were delivering the work. In 2012, I think it was, the Arts Council England changed its whole setup and created what was called national portfolio organisations. And we weren't put in that. Arts Council were not helpful with funding from that point in. So we've had to deal with a changed landscape. I think the point is the landscape is always changing, and you have to roll with the changes. In some ways, poetry is better placed for that than a symphony orchestra, because you've got less salaries to maintain and buildings to maintain, but it's still immensely short-sighted at government and council level when arts in the specific locality are not supported. It's very noticeable that when we started and were funded by Arts Council and then by City Council, Arts Council had a, if you like, branch office in Liverpool. There was a Merseyside Arts Association. We could go knock on the door, talk to people, they would come and visit us. And then that became part of a Northwest Arts Association. So if you wanted to talk to someone, you had to go to Manchester. They didn't come and see you very often. And now it's Arts Council North. We never see anyone except what we tell a computer. And I think it's, you have to be very good at answering questions on a computer to put over what you are doing. And that cannot be right. You need human beings to go visit other human beings to have any real understanding of what is being achieved. So no, austerity was not a good thing, but we're still here.
And what you said also shows that when there is the funding, when there is a good structure to support art projects, they will flourish as well.
Yeah.
They will. So yeah.
I mean, there is the argument that poets and artists produce their best work when their backs are up against the wall, but I don't think you should put their backs up against the wall just for the sake of it. Yeah.
Thanks. Yolanda, do you want to follow up on that?
Well, in our case, we were born in 2009, so we had never had a big budget for our activities, of course. We cannot bring a poet from all the way from China or India or Canada, right, to straightforward to Galicia. So we must manage and have a very big notebook of poets and to know where are they passing by each month. For example, if there is a poet that I would like to bring and he's living in New Delhi, but I know that he is going to be in London next June. From London, we have a direct flight, thanks to Vueling, that we can afford. So all these kind of synergies, synergies that we must set. I'm in contact with all the big international poetry festivals all around Spain, trying to share poets when they bring big names to Barcelona or to Andalusia, and maybe we can share them. So we must handle with it and manage, try to save money to the city, to the municipality, and make all this all these tricks to try to manage, but still we can handle it. So we are.
So you have to be inventive and you have to be constantly on the ball to find your opportunities. Yeah.
Yes, I must say we also nurture, because we have been speaking about nurturing all the scene and all that, but we also must remember other culture manifestations that are perhaps somehow smaller than us, and we can nurture them. For example, we are sending international guests to a poetry festival in Nayarit, in the interior of Galicia, that is smaller than us, but thanks to this monthly poetry series, they can have international guests or some other cultural manifestations. Or if we can prevent, if we can foresee that someone is coming, we can arrange a bigger, let's say, tour around Galicia, visiting other cities or other venues once that they are here.
So there's also a certain amount of solidarity with other organizations and like-minded people, and that solidarity facilitates and enables events to happen and synergies to develop, which without it wouldn't emerge.
That's it. That's it. We must thank the bigger manifestations that enrich us or that nurture us with big names, but we can also nurture others with our names.
Thanks, Yolanda. And Paul?
Yeah, funding. Wow, that's a bed bug for me. Funding has always been a bit of an uphill battle, I have to say. I mean, when we started this game back in 2007, the funding was very much tied up. You know, there was a sense of nepotism and same people. You know, a sense of conservative funding essentially, and you know, that's on top of the fact that Ireland has a very, very small percentage of its national budget goes to arts, way below the European average. I mean, maybe between an eighth and a tenth of the European average. It's very, very low. So it's very competitive because we are a country of many, many artists, you know, and of course then poetry, of course, is at the bottom even of that that category. In terms of a subcategory, poetry is at the very bottom. Even of literature, it's at the very bottom. So trying to get, you know, support to make poetry happen has always been difficult. I think it's getting a bit easier now, but the journey has certainly been one of fraught with politics, you know, unspoken politics. I mean, Cork, down here, we consider ourselves to be the real capital of Ireland, even though Dublin, you know, is the official capital of Ireland. We're definitely the real capital. But the Arts Council is based, unfortunately, in Dublin. We would like to change that if we can. We'll get it moved down to Cork. Maybe we can borrow some ships from Liverpool and Cornelia to help us do that. Because I think we down in Cork have we've got a better, I think, purview of what it's like to live in different parts of the country. You know, it's the biggest county in Ireland, so we're very connected also to the rural parts of Munster here. Even though we're a city, we're a very small city, so we've got a stronger, I suppose, a wider perspective on the needs within the arts from urban to rural, and I think that's lacking within the sort of Dublin-centric. You know, it's become very cosmopolitan in Dublin, and of course, you know, I love Dublin and I've got a lot of friends and family living in Dublin, so I don't want to be extrasized or, you know, banned from going back to Dublin by saying this, because I do love Dublin and I lived there before, and but the fact is that you know, the arts is kind of shrouded. It has a filter that's difficult to break through in terms of, you know, what we call traditionally the Pale, that area around Dublin that is like, you know, it's us and the rest of the world. The rest of you are all cultures or, you know, country folk, you know, simple people. So, you know, we're constantly trying to reach into the Arts Council from far away, and trying to show them that we too are, you know, in need of proper funding. We always get very small amounts. It's very hard to break through that ceiling. In Cork, we've been much luckier than the rest of the country, I will tell you. Our arts office here is particularly progressive. They are very invested and very involved in every. I'm very proud of them. I really am. Really great people, and they will give you what they have. If they have money, they'll give it to you. You know, and they'll help you to make it happen one way or the other. So we are very lucky. Unfortunately, some of our neighbouring counties are not so lucky, and they get far less opportunities than we do here. Which is another reason we need the Arts Council to move down to the real capital. Yeah, funding. You know, we've had to be inventive. You know, as you say, we've broadened our sources, our streams through linguistics, Irish language funding. We get separate. It's a completely different ball game. It's away from the Arts Council, and you know, we are a multilingual venue. So we reach into Europe as well. We've underwritten Erasmus projects with Galicia and Portugal, and also France and Italy, and we've been able to facilitate, poets going to those countries and participating in their festivals, and vice versa, based on that funding. Then there's the Scots Gaelic connection, which we have, because of course Scots Gaelic and Irish Gaelic are extremely close, in register. They're really the same language, they're just different dialects really of the same language. So we get funding to include Scots language poetry, which is very informative to our Irish Gaelic speakers here. And of course, that helps us to be involved in translation. And you will have seen a lot of that at the Winter Warmer. We'll be doing some translations here in a while for Emma Pedrera. I remember, Yolanda, we showed translations during your reading as well. So we're very much about maintaining our multicultural connections, our personal connections. We don't want to feel like we over-reliant on the national arts body. So we've diversified a lot, I think, and I think now that we've got to where we are, it looks like they might be paying a little more attention to, but fingers crossed.
In our case, I must say, our main promoter is the culture department of the city of A Coruña, but of course that is strongly affected by who wins the elections, the municipal elections, of course. So in these 13 years, I might say we have endured 4 different periods. And I think this is one of the heroic points of the project. We have endured politically speaking, very different corporations at the municipality, at the culture department of the city. The main difficulty is more connected with the bureaucracy. The laws that we have nowadays in Spain, they are called something like transparency laws. Again, just to fight against that old corruption that affected all Spain decades ago, but trying to fight against that corruption, I think they have gone to the opposite side, to really extreme positions that can be sometimes a little bit ridiculous or really strange. So we have to make public concourse to make the graphic design, and maybe we have to hire a cheaper but of course worse company, just because we cannot have the same company working for more than 3 years, because that will be like making favors to some company or wherever. And even my management has had to come to public concourse and things like that. So bureaucracy is one of the walls and that we must jump these days.
Thanks. Just in closing, if you were to send a little paper boat down your river or onto the currents of your sea, the oceans that are near us, with a few recommendations, or maybe even one recommendation to someone who might be somewhere on the other end of the river or the sea and would want to start a poetry scene in their city, what would you write on your little paper boat that you send off down that current?
I think do it if you believe in it 100%.
So not if you believe in it 98%?
No, you've got to believe in it 120%. You can't just do it because you think it might be fun for a few days. You've got to devote everything to it.
Yeah, okay. I will only write, keep the faith, stay strong, resist. Good luck.
Very similar. I echo you both, and you know, you've got to be true to yourself. Really, be true to yourself. If you can believe it's true and the heart is in it, that's all you need. Just keep going.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. We are at the end of the event, so I'm afraid we probably can't have any questions. Yeah, I just wanted to thank all of you so much. I also wanted to say to the audiences that in half an hour we will have an event which features poets that have come out of these marvelous projects. That will be another 90 minutes of great poetry from A Coruña, from Cork, and from Liverpool. Yeah, with that, I think we can close this session and just thank everybody so much. Thank the sponsors. Thank everybody for listening. And thank you, Yolanda and Paul and Dave, for sharing all your experiences. Okay, so I hope that many people will join us in half an hour. And if not, have a lovely afternoon and evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.